Let's talk about the paradox of free and open source software. A point to ponder. We hate our own opinion when it is told by someone else. Douglas Hofstadter, Richard Matthew Stallman, Linus Torvalds, and Eric S. Raymond are responsible for the free and open source software movement. Andrew Tannenbaum wrote a influential book called Introduction to Operating Systems, in which not only he talked about operating system, he in fact wrote a small operating system by the name Minix. Minix stands for Mini Unix. Under 12,000 lines of code, he could demonstrate how to write a kernel and some associated utility. In 1984, Intel came up with Intel 386 chip. It had something called protected mode, which was suitable for writing multitasking operating system. To experiment with protected mode programming, he tweaked the source code of Minix and created Linux kernel or Linus's kernel. Linus Torvalds released the kernel on the net in the year 1991. GNU project spearheaded by Stallman uh, is a set of tools without a kernel, and Linux was a kernel without tools. So people created Linux distribution by bundling Linux kernel and GNU toolchain. Let us discuss about the free software movement. Freedom software or free software movement was started by Richard Stallman in 1984. He was a professor or an employee at MIT AI lab. He was using a printer which was having some jamming problem. He contacted the manufacturer Xerox to inquire about the possibility of getting the source code of the device driver so that he can correct the problem. Xerox, citing various reasons, refused the source code access to Stallman. When Stallman contacted his friend who wrote the device driver, the friend told Stallman that Xerox has asked him not to give the source code to Stallman. Richard Stallman got angry with the incident and he started free software movement. The first utility he produced was GNU Emacs with the help of a group of volunteers. Later they shifted their focus onto GNU C compiler. In fact, tried to create a kernel based on a novel architecture called microkernel architecture, where message passing is the primary mode of communication between modules and the device drivers. It required a huge memory footprint and the operating system kernel never became a reality. Let us talk about GPL license. GPL stands for GNU Public License. Stallman and his team came up with the concept of copyleft. You can copyright your work and provide access to the source code to anyone who is interested in modifying it. Only caveat is that any derivative work should be also released in GPL. This was fine as long as everyone was producing software using GNU toolchain. For example, under Windows, if you want to link to Microsoft's runtime library, Microsoft is not going to provide the source code to you. So to work around this problem, they created GNU lesser GPL or library GPL. In the mid-90s, when internet reached critical mass, people came up with all sorts of variants. One company with a complicated licensing scheme was Trolltech, who produced Qt software. This was the library used for the GNU, for the KDE project. If you only caveat is that you have to release your source code under GPL. If you want a commercial license, you have to pay Trolltech. GPL license was a really good way to promulgate Stallman's idealism, but it didn't work at the commercial space. No businessman will trust something which he gets for free, even if he wants to. From the day one onwards, free software was having a perception problem. The first question which most developers face was, if it is free, why should I pay you? Even though GPL produced a lot of useful software, industry was slow in adopting GPL software model or GPL software license. And there were other groups who were producing free and open source software even before Stallman came into the picture. Berkeley Software Distribution and MIT had a licensing scheme which was similar to GPL in spirit, but they were not as restrictive as GPL. The problem with GPL is that any derivative work you do should be released in GPL, and it hampered commercial interest for a lot of people. But needless to say, it was a revolutionary licensing model which made computing very ubiquitous. In 1990s or in 1998, Eric S. Raymond wrote a book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, and he came up with open source, a consortium called Open Source Initiative, where the source code was free, but it didn't stipulate that you should release any derivative work as open source or free software. So this licensing model found a lot of takers, and Netscape's browser project was the first project which was released under this model. Chauvinistic about GPL, and they say that that is the only way to go. People who are neutral drifted to OSS. Bulk of the programmers were interested in getting free access to the source code rather than clinging on to idealism of Stallman. In producing tools, GPL is an effective licensing model, but for producing application, OSS seems to fare better. And there were other licensing schemes like Apache. So a Tower of Babel situation was getting generated.